My name is Adrian Holloway. I'm 35 years old, at 6:12 on a Thursday night, standing in a hospital service corridor that smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. I listened to the message that finally made everything make sense. I was still wearing my ID badge. My blazer was creased from a 14-hour day. A supply cart rattled past while a code alarm echoed somewhere behind double doors. I almost let the voicemail go to archive. Then I heard my mother's voice, calm, polished, the tone she uses when she wants strangers to think she's reasonable. "You're cut off? Don't contact us again. We're moving forward without you." A pause. And for once, stop making things harder. Your sister is family. You've only ever been useful. The line clicked dead. I didn't react, didn't call back, didn't even blink at first. I replayed it once, just to be sure I heard the contempt correctly. It wasn't anger. It was erasure, in that hallway, under fluorescent lights. I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. They hadn't just pushed me out, they had formalized the role I'd always played. I wasn't a son. I was infrastructure. A quiet system they leaned on when paperwork stalled, when money tangled, when consequences showed up uninvited. The moment I stopped being convenient, I became expendable. I sent one word back. Okay. By 8:03 the next morning, shared access was locked. By 9:17 a property transfer stalled, and the first crack in their carefully staged future split open. This wasn't a sudden rupture. It was a pattern with better lighting. Growing up, my sister Lila was the story my parents liked to tell. She was expressive, sensitive, creative, the kind of child teachers described as luminous. My mother framed her school photos like campaign posters. I was the one handed forms. At 13, I mediated arguments between my parents because I was level-headed. At 16, I read loan agreements out loud at the kitchen table because you understand this stuff better than we do. At 19, I started tracking due dates on bills no one else opened. Whenever something complicated showed up, I was summoned. Whenever something celebratory happened, Lila was showcased. My mother had a script she repeated for years. Your sister has a life to maintain. You're stronger. She's more sensitive. A real man handles pressure. That last one was her favorite. Strength, in our house, meant absorbing impact without complaint. It meant not flinching when graduate savings quietly vanished into one of my father's temporary setbacks. It meant postponing opportunities because family stability comes first. It meant wiring money to Lila when she was between things and pretending not to notice the vacation photos 2 weeks later. If I pushed back, I was cold. If I refused, I was selfish. If I fixed it, I was dependable. Lila was forgiven for chaos because she inspired pride. I was retained because I prevented collapse. That was the real division. She was loved for being impressive in public. I was valued for being functional in private. And over time, I stopped confusing usefulness with belonging. I just didn't admit it out loud. When my mother left that voicemail, she didn't invent something new. She said the quiet rule plainly. Lila was family. I was the contingency plan. My family never respected what I did for a living. They called it paperwork. They joked that I was the human version of fine print. What I actually do is risk compliance for healthcare networks and private care foundations. My job is to track where money is supposed to go, where it actually goes, and what breaks when assumptions replace documentation. I build verification chains. I stress test funding structures. I find weak joints before they snap. My parents didn't care about the title. They cared that I would read contracts they didn't understand, that I caught tax exposure before it triggered penalties, that I structured bridge arrangements cleanly enough to pass scrutiny, that my name, when attached to something, meant someone competent had reviewed it. For 6 years, I became the quiet backbone of every temporary financial emergency they manufactured and rebranded as bad luck. The latest plan was their biggest performance yet. They were selling the old family house, rolling funds through a short escrow bridge, closing on a gated townhouse near the lake, relocating my grandmother into a private residence my mother had already been boasting about at committee lunches, to their friends. It was a lifestyle upgrade, a dignified downsizing, a new chapter. What they didn't advertise was that the entire structure depended on a verification chain I had agreed against my better judgment to oversee. Not ownership, not control, just administrative authority. Shared authorization on 2 linked accounts, verification contact for source of funds documentation. Oversight language embedded in the transaction package. Nothing illegal. Just trust. And trust, in the wrong hands, becomes load-bearing. When my mother cut me off, she thought she was discarding a difficult son. What she actually removed was the one person who knew exactly which beams were hollow. At 7:43 the next morning, I sat at my kitchen island with my laptop open and my coffee untouched. I wasn't angry. Anger would have made it personal. This was procedural. When a party explicitly severs contact while still relying on your legal cooperation, you document and disengage. That's standard risk containment. So I did exactly that. First, I notified the title coordinator in writing that I was no longer serving as verification contact for the source of funds documentation package. No commentary. Just revocation. Next, I informed the broker that I withdrew authorization to communicate or clarify on behalf of the sellers, effective immediately. Then I suspended my shared access credentials pending full identity revalidation, not as punishment, as compliance. Finally, I emailed the family accountant. Any document previously routed through my review chain would need to be reissued without my credentials, my indemnification language, or my oversight notes attached. 4 messages, clear timestamps, no emotion. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't threaten exposure. I simply respected the boundary my mother had set. Don't contact us again. Understood. By 8:58 a.m., the title company flagged an incomplete verification hold. By 9:22, the escrow officer requested clarification on authorization changes. By 10:07, a contractor scheduled for the old house renovation paused work pending deposit confirmation. The system didn't explode. It hesitated, and hesitation, in time-sensitive property sequencing, is fatal. I closed my laptop and went to work. No dramatic speech, no revenge fantasy, just absence. And without the quiet infrastructure they'd relied on for years, their seamless transition began to stall in places they hadn't even known were fragile. The first call came at 11:16 a.m. I let it ring. Then another. Then 3 more within 10 minutes. It's interesting how quickly "don't contact us again" transforms into "why aren't you answering" when paperwork stops moving. By noon, the townhouse closing had been placed on hold. The seller's attorney refused to proceed without updated verification language. The escrow officer requested direct confirmation from an authorized reviewer, one who no longer existed. At 12:47, my father left his first voicemail. "There's been a misunderstanding. 22 minutes later, you need to call us today. By 3:04 p.m. The dignity had drained out of his voice entirely. "The title company says there's a hold. Patricia says you pulled authorization. I don't know what you're trying to prove, but this has to be fixed before end of day." I was reviewing an audit report when my phone vibrated across my desk like something trying to escape. The family group chat, silent for weeks, came back to life. Lila didn't ask if I was okay. She wrote, "How could you do this right before the move? Mom is humiliated." Humiliated, not concerned, not confused, humiliated. An hour later, another ripple hit. The restoration contractor for the old house paused their move-out timeline. The deposit confirmation didn't match expected authorization. Without clear funds sequencing, they wouldn't release the crew schedule. By early evening, a private care facility, one my mother had been courting for my grandmother, requested updated financial assurances before reserving the suite she'd already been bragging about. That detail stopped me. Grandma wasn't just being relocated. She was being leveraged inside a chain of promises built on projected liquidity that no longer had structural support. At 6:32 p.m., my mother finally left a message. Her tone wasn't cold anymore. It was furious. She called me vindictive, unstable, ungrateful. Then, in the same breath, she demanded I fix this immediately. No acknowledgement of the voicemail. No recognition that she had told me to disappear. Just outrage that I had complied. By midnight, I had 58 missed calls. Not exaggerated, not theatrical, 58. Each one marking the exact speed at which control drains from people who only remember your value when the system stops functioning without you. 2 days after the voicemail, I received an email from a law office. Subject: urgent transaction clarification required. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the signature. Thomas Reed, counsel representing my parents. Lawyers don't describe things as urgent unless something expensive is actively deteriorating. I answered on the second call. He began carefully. "There have been complications tied to the property sequence and certain third-party expectations." I asked him to stop translating. He paused. Then he spoke plainly. My parents had already presented themselves to the seller, the care facility, and members of my mother's charity board as fully liquid. The deposit for my grandmother's private residence had been described as secured by proceeds from the townhouse purchase, which depended on the sale of the old house which now sat stalled in verification review. Worse, my role had been described as ongoing, not explicitly forged, not in writing, but implied. Several parties, he said carefully, appear to believe you are still overseeing compliance. My chest didn't tighten. It cooled. I asked one question. Has anyone suggested I'm still attached to the authorization chain after I revoked it in writing silence? Then there may have been assumptions based on prior involvement. Assumptions? That's what people call it when they continue using your credibility after you withdraw consent. I ended the call with one instruction: all communication in writing. But the real shift came later that night. A care liaison forwarded a clarification request. Professional. Polite. They weren't asking me to fund anything. They were asking whether the financial structure previously represented by the family remained valid. The implication was surgical. My mother had been positioning herself publicly as financially secure while stacking promises on top of projected money. Money that only appeared stable because my name had been quietly reinforcing it. This stopped being about hurt feelings. It became about containment. If the structure collapsed while my credibility hovered in the background, I wouldn't just be the estranged son. I'd be the compliance officer whose reputation was dragged into a fantasy built on unsecured assumptions. That's when I opened a clean folder. Voicemail, revocation notices, timestamps, care inquiries, message threads. Not to destroy them, to ensure the truth had structure. My mother liked to say our family had survived so much together. That phrasing used to confuse me. Survival implies shared burden. What we had was redistribution. At 21, my graduate school fund was quietly redirected to stabilize one of my father's failed investments. I was told not to overreact. You'll recover faster than we will, my mother said. You're practical. At 27, I declined an overseas compliance position, one I'd worked toward for years, because my parents were in transition and needed someone steady at home. The transition never ended. It just changed names. At 31, Lila showed up at my apartment in tears over overdue bills. I wired money that night. 3 weeks later, she posted photos from a resort I couldn't pronounce. When I asked about it, she said I was interrogating her like a stranger. Every time I objected, I was labeled harsh. Every time I rescued them, I was praised for loyalty. That was the mechanism. Crisis, guilt, rescue, amnesia, over and over. When I tried to step back, I was told I was becoming distant, cold, hard to love lately. But when I solved things, untangled debts, structured payment plans, reviewed documents no one else read, I was what good sons do. Not loved, useful. And that distinction matters more than people admit. Because if usefulness is the price of belonging, you never actually belong. You just renew your membership by absorbing the next impact. When my mother said I owed them cooperation, it wasn't emotional exaggeration, it was accounting. I had been the family's silent line of credit for over a decade, and the night she cut me off, she assumed the account would remain open anyway. By the third day, I had assembled everything. The voicemail where my mother cut me off, the time-stamped revocation notices, the broker acknowledgement, the accountant's confirmation, the care facility's funding clarification, screenshots from the family group chat, organized, indexed, clean, not dramatic, just accurate. That afternoon, my phone rang from a blocked number. I answered. No greeting, no hesitation. How dare you embarrass us like this? Not why are you doing this? Not what happened. Embarrass. That was the axis her world spun on. I told her the embarrassment came from presenting a lifestyle secured by money that hadn't cleared and promises that weren't stable. She snapped that everything they had done was for the family, that I was selfish, that I had always enjoyed feeling superior because I understood systems they didn't. Then she said the sentence that ended whatever hesitation I had left. After everything we invested in you, you owed us cooperation. Owed. Not love, not trust. Debt, in her mind. My education was an asset. My career was leverage. My credibility was a family resource to be deployed when optics required reinforcement. I wasn't a son stepping back. I was inventory refusing redistribution. I realized then that this had never been about my grandmother's care, or the house, or stress. It was about narrative control. If the structure collapsed publicly, my mother needed someone to absorb the blame, and I had just removed myself from the script. That's when I understood something with uncomfortable clarity. She didn't fear losing me. She feared losing the image of stability my name quietly provided. 3 nights later. A mutual contact forwarded me something with no commentary. Just one line. You may want to see this. It was the updated invitation from my mother's charity committee reception. The venue had changed back to the historic conservatory. The townhouse, still not legally theirs, was no longer mentioned, but my name was. Not directly, not explicitly. In the donor introduction draft. My mother was described as a devoted son, navigating the emotional strain of an estranged child who chose resentment over responsibility during a critical family transition. Resentment. Irresponsibility. She wasn't just managing fallout, she was preloading the narrative. If the property sequence collapsed, she would already be framed as the dignified caregiver under attack from a difficult son. I read it twice. She hadn't only cut me out of the family, she was attempting to cut me out of credibility. And if I stayed silent, that version would calcify into fact inside rooms that mattered. So I made a decision. Not to cause a scene, not to humiliate anyone, but to interrupt a lie before it settled into permanence. I would attend the reception not as an accuser, as a correction. I arrived early, not to make an entrance, just to control the temperature of my own pulse before walking into a room built for performance. The conservatory was all glass and winter greenery, polished wood floors reflecting chandelier light, champagne flutes, low laughter, people who had mastered the art of looking compassionate in public. I spotted my mother immediately, Eleanor Holloway in structured navy, smiling with that softened expression she only wore when donors were watching. My father stood near a display table, speaking too quickly to a man in a gray suit. Lila was laughing beside a trustee I recognized from a regional healthcare board. For a few seconds, I watched them operate. Then my mother saw me. Her face didn't change gradually. It froze. She crossed the room with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked, barely moving her lips. "I was invited into the story," I said evenly. "Thought I should hear it firsthand." Her jaw tightened. "This is not the place. You made it the place." 2 donors had already turned subtly in our direction. Wealthy rooms don't explode, they lean in. My father approached next. "Adrian," he said under his breath. "Let's step outside. I'm fine here." Lila appeared at my side. Perfume sharp, voice brittle. "Can you not do this tonight? Mom is barely holding it together." I looked at her. Holding what together? That's when my mother tried the emotional pivot. "This is about your grandmother," she said, louder now, enough to sound wounded. Silence travels differently in affluent spaces. It doesn't slam, it crystallizes. "Then let's talk about Grandma," I said calmly. A trustee a few feet away shifted closer without pretending not to listen. I kept my voice steady. "Were the care residence administrators informed that the deposit depends on a property closing that hasn't occurred?" My mother's smile flickered. I continued. "Was the seller informed about the repair exposure on the old house before projected liquidity was presented publicly?" My father's gaze dropped to the floor. "And did anyone hear?" I said, turning slightly toward Lila. "Tell third parties that I was still overseeing compliance after I withdrew authorization in writing." There it was. No shouting, no accusations. Just questions. The kind that don't require volume because they carry structure. Lila started crying, on cue. My mother tried to interrupt. "You're being cruel. This is private family business." A trustee stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway," he said gently, "are you not involved in the transition?" "Not after I was told not to contact them again," I replied. "I have the voicemail and revocation notices timestamped if clarity is needed." The air changed. My mother went pale, not angry, pale, cornered pale. The board chair moved toward her with the composure of someone who understands reputational risk. My father attempted dignity. "This is a misunderstanding." "Is it?" I asked. Lila whispered. "You're destroying everything." "No," I said quietly. I stepped out of something I was told I didn't belong in. That's when the most surgical moment arrived. An older donor, someone with the kind of money that never raises its voice, spoke from near the champagne table. "Eleanor," she said evenly, "were charitable commitments discussed before your own household obligations were secured? It was a precise sentence. Precise sentences end performances." My mother opened her mouth, closed it, because the question wasn't about generosity, it was about representation. Had she been leveraging social credibility while standing on projected funds reinforced by a son she'd publicly vilified? The answer was visible in her silence. Within minutes, the event coordinator whispered to someone from legal. My father looked physically ill. Lila's mascara had begun to run. But no one important was comforting her. Graham Reed, the attorney, appeared near the coat check with none of his earlier composure. "Adrian," he said urgently, "can we resolve this quietly? Quietly." The word people use when they mean before consequences become permanent. "I have no interest in spectacle," I replied. "Only distance and accuracy." He lowered his voice. "Your parents are facing serious exposure. The property sequence is collapsing. The board is concerned about representations made regarding liquidity." "That sounds serious," I said, "and I meant it. But seriousness does not create obligation. I didn't stay to watch the room finish recalibrating. I didn't need to. The truth had structure now, and once truth enters a room built on assumption, it doesn't shout, it settles. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not relief, stillness. For years, I had been the invisible beam holding up their image. That evening, I didn't tear the structure down. I simply removed myself from beneath it. And when a building begins to tilt after that, it tells you everything about who was actually carrying the weight. Let me ask you something. If your silence had been the foundation of someone else's performance, would speaking once to correct the record be revenge or self-defense? Public exposure doesn't feel cinematic when it's yours. I went home that night and sat in the dark with my coat still on. No victory speech, no adrenaline high, just a body that wouldn't power down. My jaw ached from clenching. My hands trembled slightly when I reached for water. Every sound in my apartment felt amplified. I replayed the conservatory scene in fragments not because I regretted telling the truth, but because I'd been trained for years to expect punishment whenever I stopped absorbing impact for them. By morning, the tactics shifted. My father texted that my mother's blood pressure had spiked and that I needed to think about what stress does to people at her age. Lila sent a long message about trauma, loyalty, and how I had escalated a private misunderstanding. My mother alternated between silence and short, venom-laced accusations. She claimed I had jeopardized my grandmother's future out of pride. Not one of them acknowledged sequence. She cut me off. They continued using my credibility. I withdrew formally. The structure exposed itself. But conditioning doesn't evaporate because logic wins. What unsettled me wasn't guilt over speaking. It was the reflex underneath it, the part of me that still wanted permission to fix everything. I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was a role I had been rehearsing since adolescence. The responsible son, the quiet stabilizer, the one who doesn't flinch. And for the first time, I had stepped off stage. The silence afterward wasn't peaceful, it was disorienting. Because when you stop being the safety net, you also stop knowing who you are without the fall. I didn't go to therapy for closure. I went because my hands were still shaking when my inbox refreshed. Dr. Mercer didn't offer sympathy first. She offered precision. When did your family teach you that usefulness was the price of belonging? The question landed harder than the conservatory ever had. I thought about it. 13. Mediating arguments because I was the calm one. 16. Reading loan documents while the adults nodded along. 21. Delaying my plans because a good son steps up. 28. Realizing there would never be a final emergency, only rotating crises tied together by entitlement. She didn't tell me to forgive. She told me to document. So I wrote it down. The graduate fund redirected. The career move postponed. The financial rescues rebranded as loyalty. The way tears rerouted labor in my sister's favor. On paper. It stopped looking like family chaos. It looked like systematic extraction. Not explosive, not dramatic, consistent. And once something has a name, it becomes harder to crawl back inside it. I wasn't abandoning them. I was stepping out of a system that only functioned if I stayed inside it. My father asked to meet like adults. He said we needed one conversation without witnesses. I almost declined, but I wanted to see the structure up close without chandeliers, without donors, without curated language. The old house looked mid-transition and mid-collapse at the same time. Designer chairs wrapped in moving blankets, artwork missing from the walls, hairline cracks in the entry molding that apparently hadn't mattered 2 weeks earlier. My mother was already seated at the dining table when I walked in. Composed, controlled. Lila sat beside her, red-eyed but defiant. So much for private. For the first 10 minutes. They tried revision. The voicemail was sent in anger. Everyone was under pressure. No one misrepresented anything intentionally. You escalated this publicly. I let them finish. Then I placed printed pages on the table one at a time. Revocation notice, title correspondence, accountant confirmation, care liaison inquiry, event draft language. Each page flattened a layer of ambiguity. The room shifted. Facts do that. They strip manipulative warmth from the air. My mother's composure cracked first. You've always enjoyed making us feel small because you understand systems better than we do. That was projection disguised as accusation. My father snapped next. If you had just helped instead of acting superior. None of this would have happened. There it was again. Help. Meaning absorb consequences quietly. Lila leaned forward, voice shaking. You always act like the money was yours. I met her eyes. Not the money, I said. The liability. Silence. Because that was the center of it. They wanted access without accountability. Image without solvency. Commitments without capacity. Then my mother said the thing that ended whatever emotional hesitation remained in me. We assumed you'd postpone your condo purchase this year. Someone responsible had to think long-term. Assumed. She said it casually, as if my future were adjustable inventory. As if my life were a line item in the family ledger. Something went very still inside me then. Not anger, not hurt, clarity. For years, I said evenly. You've treated my stability as shared property. It isn't. My father called that selfish. My mother called it abandonment. Lila whispered that I would regret this when Grandma suffered. I looked at all three of them and realized something important. None of them were asking what was true. They were asking whether I would resume my role. I'm done, I said. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just done. I will not restore access. I will not attach my name to any transaction. I will not intervene with the board, the broker, the care facility, or anyone else. If explanations are required, you can give them yourselves. My mother stood up so abruptly, her chair scraped across hardwood. You're destroying this family. No, I said calmly. I stopped holding it up. Lila tried one last tactic. What about Grandma? You're punishing her to get back at Mom. That one almost landed. Almost. The person who endangered Grandma, I replied, was the one who used her as proof of wealth before the numbers cleared. My father swore under his breath. My mother's voice dropped into something cold and final. If you walk out that door like this, don't expect things to ever be the same. I paused. They weren't the same long before I walked in. Then I gathered the papers I didn't need to leave behind and headed for the door. They were still speaking when I stepped outside. Still arguing. Still reframing. But for the first time. None of it required my participation. That house, the one they had treated like a symbol of continuity, felt different behind me. Not tragic, structural. Some buildings don't collapse because someone leaves. They collapse because the weight was always miscalculated. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't standing underneath it. The fallout didn't explode, it unraveled. 6 weeks was all it took. The old house didn't sell on their timeline. The buyer demanded expanded disclosures and a repair credit large enough to erase the illusion of profit. Once contractors documented the real scope of structural issues, the leverage evaporated. The lakefront townhouse went under contract with someone else within days. Clean paperwork, verified liquidity, no verification gaps. The private care residents withdrew their reservation for my grandmother after internal review flagged inconsistent financial representations. Pending clarification in institutional language means trust has thinned. My mother was asked politely to step back from the Elder Support Committee until concerns were resolved, in polished social circles. That's exile without announcement. Invitations slowed, then stopped. Lila's curated lifestyle cracked next. The joint emergency line she had drained surfaced once no one was quietly redirecting exposure. The boyfriend who admired curated luxury had strong opinions about debt disclosure. That relationship dissolved quickly. My father, who once treated certain consulting roles as beneath him, accepted one to stabilize cash flow. Pride becomes negotiable when numbers don't cooperate. They called it a string of unfortunate timing. It wasn't timing, it was gravity. As for my grandmother, I refused to let her become collateral. I did not step back into the financial chain. I did not reattach my name to their accounts. Instead, through a separate channel, clean, documented, Independent, I worked with a social worker contact to secure a modest, reputable placement. No marble lobby, no donor narrative, just safe care and honest billing. When my mother found out, she accused me of downgrading Grandma's future. Downgrading. As if dignity required chandeliers. That word told me everything. For her, care had always been presentation first, reality second. For me, it was the opposite. And for the first time, I didn't argue. I simply remained unavailable for distortion. About a month later, Thomas Reed contacted me again. This time, there was no urgency in his tone, only containment. The charity board, the lender, and the care facility all requested a documented timeline clarifying when I withdrew from any family-related transactions, not for drama, for record integrity. I agreed, not to protect my parents, to protect my name. I drafted a precise statement. 1 page, structured, dated. It outlined the voicemail instructing me not to maintain contact, the exact timestamps of my revocation notices, confirmation of suspended authorization, my written communication to all relevant parties. No accusations, no commentary, no emotional footnotes, just sequence. When you document the order of events clearly, blame has nowhere soft to land. I signed it, sent it, closed the folder. It was quieter than confrontation, more final than shouting. Because once the timeline was fixed in writing, the narrative shifted permanently. I wasn't the unstable son who sabotaged a transition. I was the professional who stepped away and documented it. Sometimes the cleanest boundary isn't a speech, it's a record. My mother requested one final meeting, not at a cafe, not at the house, at her attorney's office. By then, even she understood that everything between us required witnesses. The conference room was sterile glass table, neutral art, filtered light. My father sat beside her. Lila wasn't there. For a moment, I saw the outline of the old performance preparing to reassemble. It didn't. My mother started with hardship. How stressed they had been. How humiliating the scrutiny felt. How much had been lost because things spiraled. She never used the word sorry. She used unfortunate. She used miscommunication. She used family strain. I let her finish. Then I said the only sentence that mattered. You told me not to contact you again. I respected that. You continued using what I built after pushing me out. That's why everything broke. Silence. Real silence this time. Not curated. My father stared at the table. My mother's eyes filled. But tears aren't confession. They're reaction. Finally, she asked, almost cautiously, is there any way to fix this? That question used to undo me. It didn't now. You can't fix this with me, I said evenly. You can only live with what happened without turning me into the repair crew again. She flinched at that. My father cleared his throat. So what does this mean you're cutting us off forever? I met his eyes. No, you did that first. I'm just refusing to crawl back into the opening. No anger, no raised voice, just boundary. I stood, gathered my coat, and walked out of the office while my mother called my name in the tone she once used to summon compliance. History didn't reverse. Some doors closed quietly, and this one did. People like neat endings, confessions, reunions, holidays where everyone pretends growth happened naturally. That's not what this was. My mother never regained her committee position. In rooms that revolve around image, credibility doesn't return once it fractures publicly. My father sold the old house months later for less than they had once bragged about after repairs he could no longer dismiss as cosmetic. Lila downsized fast. The social circles she curated thinned when the financial scaffolding disappeared. It turns out, curated luxury is fragile when it isn't subsidized by someone else's stability. The story that I was unstable, bitter, vindictive never quite stuck. Too many people had seen enough to question it. Once documentation exists, narrative control weakens. As for me, that fall. I bought my condo. The one they once assumed I would postpone because someone else's crisis mattered more than my future. I signed a loan. No group chat, no announcement, no request for blessing. Just a clean pen, a clean title, and silence that felt earned instead of imposed. People misunderstand revenge. They think it's volume, exposure, fireworks under chandeliers. Sometimes it's documentation, boundaries, absence applied at the right structural point. Sometimes the most destabilizing thing you can do to people who built their identity on your unpaid loyalty is to let them experience the full weight of a life constructed without your reinforcement. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped carrying it. and in the space that opened afterwards, I finally had room to stand as something other than useful.